Something about this update doesn't just add information, it shifts the entire direction of the case. Up until now, everything has been focused on where Ashley passed, the final location, the room, the last moments. That's where all the attention has been. But what if the most important part of the story isn't at the end, it's at the beginning? Because before she ever got to that resort, she was somewhere else, a completely different place where she spent days, not hours, where she was celebrating, exploring, living in the moment, a place where something major happened, something that should have made that location impossible to ignore. But it was ignored, and that's the first thing that doesn't sit right. Because in situations like this, you don't just focus on where something ended, you go back to where it started. You trace every step, every location, every interaction that led up to that moment, and somehow the first place she stayed barely became part of the conversation. Now that alone would be strange, but it gets worse, because that location is now speaking out, not to help, not to clarify, but to distance itself fast. And the way they're doing it doesn't feel normal, it feels controlled. The moment you look at what that first location actually said, the tone becomes impossible to ignore. Because instead of focusing on Ashley as a person, instead of leading with concern or even basic sympathy, the statement shifts attention somewhere else entirely. Her online presence, the fact that she was posting, documenting, sharing her experience. And that might sound like a small detail, but it isn't, because framing matters, and the way someone is described shapes how people see what happened to them. Instead of reinforcing who she was, the language subtly reduces her to what she did online. An influencer, someone posting content, someone putting things out there, and that creates distance. It makes the situation feel less personal, less serious, easier to separate from, and that's where it starts to feel intentional. Because this wasn't just any guest passing through, this was someone bringing visibility to the exact place she stayed, someone whose presence had value, real value in terms of exposure and attention. So for that same place to respond by quickly distancing themselves instead of showing care doesn't line up with what you would expect. And that mismatch is what creates tension. Because now it's not just about what they said, it's about why they chose to say it that way. And once you start looking at it like that, the focus shifts again, because it starts to feel less like a response to a situation and more like an attempt to control how that situation is perceived. What makes it even harder to ignore is how little attention this location received from the people actually responsible for investigating the situation. Because when you look at how everything was handled early on, there's a clear focus on the final resort, but almost no real emphasis on where the trip started. And that's not how timelines are supposed to work. In a situation like this, the first location is critical. It's where you establish baseline behavior, where you understand how things were unfolding before anything changed. It's where you check for consistency, interactions, any early signs that something wasn't right. And yet none of that was publicly prioritized. There was no visible push to review footage from that location.
Today, investigators in Tanzania held a news conference where they said they are questioning McCann and they are holding his passport until the autopsy results are complete. And Tony, we did reach out to McCann and have not heard back.
No detailed breakdown of what happened during those days, no strong effort to connect that part of the timeline to what came after, and that absence matters, because when something important is missing from the investigation, it creates a gap, and gaps like that don't stay neutral, they raise questions. Because if everything at that first location was completely normal, proving that would have been easy, it would have strengthened the overall timeline and supported whatever explanation came later. But instead, it feels like that step was either delayed or avoided, and that's where the tension builds. Because now you're not just looking at what was investigated, you're looking at what wasn't, and that difference starts to feel just as important as anything that was actually addressed. What makes this even more complicated is how quickly the situation was initially explained, because before a full timeline was built, before every location was fully examined, there was already a conclusion being pushed. And that kind of speed doesn't usually happen when everything is being carefully investigated step by step. It creates pressure to accept an answer before all the pieces are actually connected. And now, with this first location coming into focus, that early explanation starts to feel less stable because it wasn't built from a complete picture. If you don't fully examine where someone was before, if you don't connect those days to what happened after, then any conclusion is missing part of the story. And that's where the gap becomes more obvious. because now it's not just about what happened, it's about whether everything leading up to it was properly accounted for. When an investigation moves forward without fully locking in the beginning, it creates a foundation that isn't solid, and anything built on top of that starts to feel uncertain.
Now to a growing mystery, the death of a lifestyle influencer, Ashley Robinson, better known online as Ashley Janae. Just days after popping the question overseas, her fiancé is now being held in Zanzibar by investigators trying to figure out what happened.
That's exactly what's happening here, because the more this first location is discussed, the more it feels like something important was skipped, and that makes everything that came after harder to trust. Now, when you bring the timeline back into focus, this is where it really starts to matter, because Ashley and her partner didn't just pass through that first location. They stayed there for days. They arrived, settled in, explored, celebrated her birthday, and got engaged before ever moving on. That's not a minor detail, that's a full part of the story. And everything that happened during that time helps establish what things looked like before anything changed. It shows behavior, energy, interaction, the kind of details investigators usually rely on to understand what's normal versus what isn't. And that's exactly why it's so important, because if everything during those days was stable, if everything was consistent, then that becomes the baseline for the rest of the timeline. But if anything during that time wasn't fully examined, then that baseline is missing. And without a clear starting point, the rest of the story doesn't have something solid to connect back to. That's what makes this part so critical, because the beginning isn't just background, it's the reference point for everything that comes after. And when that reference point isn't clearly established, the entire timeline starts to feel incomplete. Another thing that starts to stand out is what wasn't said publicly about that first location, because the absence of detail becomes just as noticeable as the details that were shared. There was no clear breakdown of interactions, no confirmed review of surveillance, no visible effort to connect those days to the final outcome, and that silence creates weight. Because when something is fully examined, it usually shows there are updates, confirmations, small pieces of clarity that build over time. But here, that part of the timeline feels quiet, almost like it's sitting outside the main focus. And that's where it starts to feel intentional, because leaving something out of the narrative doesn't just remove information, it changes how the entire situation is understood. Now, instead of seeing a full sequence, you're seeing a partial one. And partial timelines always raise more questions than they answer. Because if nothing happened there, proving that would be simple, it would strengthen everything that comes after. But without that confirmation, the gap remains, and that gap keeps pulling attention back to the same point. What exactly happened during those days that hasn't been clearly shown? What makes this even heavier is how the first location chose to respond once attention started shifting toward it. Because instead of stepping in with clarity, with structure, with anything that could actually help build a clearer timeline, the focus stayed on distancing and protecting their image. And that's where the tone starts to matter even more. There's no real effort to walk people through what happened during those days, no detailed account of interactions, no reassurance backed by facts, just a strong push to separate themselves from the outcome. And when that's the priority, it changes how everything feels. Because in a situation like this, where someone spent multiple days at a property, there should be more to say. There should be context, confirmation, something that helps close the gap. But instead, that gap stays open, and the way it's being handled makes it feel even wider. Now layer that on top of everything else.
Ashley Robinson was on the vacation of a lifetime. She was in Zanzibar, which is off the coast of Tanzania. She was there celebrating her 31st birthday. Her boyfriend of about a year and a half, Joe McCann, proposed to her on the trip, but last week something went terribly wrong.
A location that plays a major role in the timeline isn't fully examined early on. The investigation moves forward without clearly locking in those details, and when that location finally speaks, it doesn't bring clarity, it reinforces distance. That combination is what creates pressure, because now it's not just about missing information, it's about how that missing information is being treated. It doesn't feel like something being actively filled in, it feels like something being pushed aside. And when that happens, people don't move on from it, they go back to it. Because the beginning of a story like this isn't optional, it's foundational. It's where everything starts to make sense or fall apart. And when that foundation isn't clearly established, every explanation that comes after carries that same uncertainty. That's why this part keeps coming back into focus, because until those first days are fully understood, the rest of the timeline doesn't feel complete. Then something shifts again, because this isn't just about one location anymore. It's about how the entire situation is being handled across the board. The moment outside attention starts getting involved, the tone changes, the pace changes, and decisions that should have been made early suddenly start happening later. That kind of shift doesn't come out of nowhere. It usually means something didn't fully hold up under closer review. And when that happens, everything that was previously accepted starts getting re-examined. Now the focus isn't just on the outcome, it's on the process, how quickly conclusions were made, what was included, what was left out, and why certain parts of the timeline weren't emphasized from the start. And that's where the pressure builds again, because once a situation moves beyond local handling, it's being looked at from a different standard, one that isn't tied to the original narrative. And if there are gaps, inconsistencies, or missing pieces, they don't stay quiet for long. They become more visible. That's why this stage matters so much, because it's no longer just about what happened. It's about whether everything leading up to it was handled the way it should have been. And right now, that question is still open. But here's where the situation takes another turn, because once you start looking at how everything is being handled, a pattern begins to show. And it's not just about missing details anymore. It's about what's being prioritized. The focus keeps circling back to protecting the outcome, closing the case, controlling the narrative, while the beginning of the timeline still isn't fully connected. And that creates a disconnect that's hard to ignore.
Police say Robinson was found unconscious in her villa and was rushed to the hospital where she later died. Now, her parents tell me they received a call from McCann, the boyfriend, acknowledging that something had happened. But they say it was the resort where Robinson was staying that notified the family of their daughter's death.
Because in a situation like this, clarity should come from building the full sequence step by step, not from narrowing the story down before everything is verified. And yet that's what it feels like is happening. The attention moves forward faster than the information behind it. And when that happens, it raises a different kind of question, not just what happened, but why the process looks the way it does. Because when certain parts of the story are consistently left in the background, it changes how everything else is interpreted. It makes it harder to trust that the full picture is being considered. And that's where the tension really settles in, because now it's not just about the events themselves, it's about whether the process of understanding those events is complete. And right now, it doesn't feel like it is. Now, this is where everything starts coming together in a way that's hard to ignore, because when you step back and look at the full sequence, the issue isn't just one missing detail, it's how multiple pieces don't fully connect at the same time. You have a beginning that wasn't fully examined, a timeline that skips over key days, a response from that first location that focuses on distance instead of clarity, and an investigation that moved forward before locking all of that in. Each part on its own might not seem overwhelming, but together they create a pattern. And patterns like that are what people pay attention to. Because when everything is aligned, the story feels stable, it makes sense, it holds up no matter how many times you look at it. But when pieces don't line up, even slightly, it creates tension that doesn't go away. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because now it's not just about finding one answer, it's about connecting everything into a complete timeline that actually holds. And until that happens, the situation doesn't feel resolved, it feels unfinished. At this point, the focus naturally shifts from just what happened to how everything is being connected, because that's where the real issue sits now. It's not just about isolated details anymore. It's about whether all those details actually form a complete and consistent picture. And when you really look at it, that picture still feels fragmented. The beginning of the trip isn't fully anchored, the transition between locations isn't clearly mapped out, and the explanations that came early don't seem to fully account for everything that's now coming into focus. That kind of disconnect doesn't just create confusion, it creates doubt about the structure of the entire timeline.
Do you believe that Joe McCann had something to do with your daughter's death?
It's under investigation, and we don't know what went on.
It's under investigation, and like we said, we just want transparency.
And that's what keeps this from settling. Because when a situation is fully understood, everything reinforces itself. The timeline supports the explanation matches the details, and every part of the story points in the same direction. But here it feels like each layer is still trying to catch up to the other. New information keeps forcing a re-evaluation of what was already said, and that loop prevents anything from feeling final. It's like the story is constantly being adjusted instead of confirmed. That's where the weight of this really sits. Because now the question isn't just what happened at one moment, it's whether the entire sequence leading up to that moment has been fully understood. And if even one major part of that sequence, like the first location, hasn't been clearly established, then everything connected to it remains uncertain. That's why this part keeps coming back into focus, because it's not just another detail. It's a foundational piece that affects how the entire situation is interpreted. And until that foundation is fully clear, nothing else truly locks into place. At this point, everything comes down to one thing: not assumptions, not early explanations, but the full timeline being clearly laid out from start to finish. Because that's the only way this situation actually settles. The beginning has to connect to the middle, and the middle has to connect to the end without gaps, without missing pieces, without anything left unclear. And right now, that connection still isn't fully there. The first location, the days spent there, the transition to the final resort, all of it needs to be part of one complete sequence that holds up on its own. Because until that happens, every explanation feels partial, and that's why this doesn't feel finished. Because this isn't just about what happened in one moment, it's about everything that led up to that moment being properly understood, the way it was handled early on, the parts that were emphasized, the parts that were left in the background. All of that shapes how the situation is seen now. And when those pieces don't fully align, it keeps the story open. Not in a dramatic way, but in a structural way, where things don't fully settle because they don't fully connect. That's where everything stands. Not with a final answer, but with a situation that still needs that full clarity, that full timeline, that complete connection between every part of the story. Because once that becomes visible, everything either makes sense or it doesn't. And until then, this isn't something that can just be closed.